From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, syndicating across the country on the Business Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio, WYBC.com, and 1490 AM WGCH, Greenwich, Connecticut. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Inside the Magic Kingdom, the secrets of how Disney's unique culture has created one of the world's best customer service businesses, how Disney University develops and maintains the Disney DNA. Today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell, Doug Lipp is a Disney insider, having spent the bulk of his career at the Disney University as a member of the training department. He helped create the first international version of Disney U as an expatriate manager at Tokyo Disneyland. And he's now an internationally acclaimed speaker, author, consultant on customer service, leadership, change management, and global competitiveness. Also the author of 8 books on leadership, customer service, and international business. His new book just out, Disney U, How Disney University Develops the World's Most Engaged, Loyal, and Customer-Centric Employees. Welcome, Doug, early in the morning out on the West Coast.
Jim, thanks very much, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and everybody who's listening to Business Talk. I'm thrilled to chat about this subject.
Okay, it's our honor. I'm going to start out just on a big picture basis. We'll drill down later. What is the Disney DNA, the core of the culture, if you had to sort of sum it up?
The man that I write about in Disney U summed it up for me, which makes it easier, and I just write about it. He talked about innovate, which means take risk. He talked about leadership support, which means the executives walk and talk the same language that everybody is taught in training, from the 16-year-old frontline person to the board of directors. So there's innovate, there's support, there's educate. So the value of education is never questioned within the organization. And then finally, as you'd expect from Disney, is the power of entertainment and how in an educational environment you can entertain and have fun and still learn tremendous amounts.
I want to initially talk about the impact of Walt Disney, obviously the original core of the vision, and maintain quality, keep the park clean, and keep it friendly was sort of his basic code. Talk about Walt Disney and his leadership style.
Well, he was a demanding leader. I never got to work directly with Walt, Jim, but my mentor, Van France, and many of the men and women that I worked with and for did work directly with Walt. Even Ron Miller, who was the CEO when I was in the company before Michael Eisner came on board, he is Walt Disney's son-in-law. So he got to see Walt in a business and in a personal environment. And indeed, as any creative leader would be, he expected and got the most out of his staff. And when you produced, you were rewarded, and when you didn't produce, you were told produce. So it was not a situation where everybody sat around and held hands and sang songs, but most definitely he promoted the idea of work hard and play hard.
Would Disney be a lot different if he was still in charge today?
You know, that's the $1,000 million trillion question, Jim, and I think that is it's hard to answer. In fact, that's really one of the things that helped drive the company into fairly deep depths of almost losing the entire organization, is people sitting around wondering, what would it be like if Walt were still alive? So many would argue, yes, it would have changed many, many years ago, and there's just really no way to answer that.
That's an interesting point we'll talk later about when they sort of got off the rails there. Do you think in his vision that he could have entertained thoughts of something like ESPN, the ABC broadcasting company, the retail component, those things becoming part of the family?
I think so. In fact, when you walk through, there's a tremendously educational museum in San Francisco dedicated to Walt. His daughter Diane started it, and it's only 2 years old, called the Walt Disney Family Museum. And when you walk through that museum, Jim, and you see the stuff that he created decades ago that at the time might not have had a market, but he did it anyway, to blaze new trails. For example, the feature film Fantasia was a complete flop when it came out, but it led to new techniques for stereophonic sound and artistry. I would have to argue, yes, you just don't know how far it would have gone.
We've talked about the impact of Walt's death. Roy Disney was then sort of the chairman. I don't know if it was more of an emeritus type of oversight and keep the culture going. The impact of his death?
Well, it certainly was. In fact, I write about this in Disney U because Roy passed away just after the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World opened. And so in a relatively short period of time, you had the two founding brothers of the organization pass away, and certainly Roy had a huge impact on the company, and he's oftentimes cited as the financial genius. He was a creative genius in his own right, and he did much more than just maintain Walt's message. He created some of his own messages as well, and he, I think, is fundamentally responsible for the maintenance of the traditions and the DNA of the organization.
I know that Disneyland, I think, was 1955, or that was a key component, and that's my exact birthday year. So I'm going to ask you a little bit, how do you think Disneyland has fundamentally changed from the origination period and where we are today?
Well, you and I share the same birthday year. It's 1955 was a good year. You and I were born, as was Disneyland. So, how have you and I changed since then? It's amazing. Yes, the area around it certainly has changed. So there's much more competition for employees that Disney, of course, calls cast members. And so one example is something that was draconian at the time and now would not pass very well at all is the Disney look, which meant that male cast members could not have facial hair, female cast members could not have eyeliner and earrings larger than a quarter of an inch in diameter. And quite frankly, the times have changed, and now you have people in professional positions. You've got bankers, you've got attorneys that are sporting goatees and mustaches and beards. And so one example, which may sound ridiculously superficial, but it's a tremendous challenge to the organization over the years, was adjusting something as simple as the grooming policy to attract more employees.
You were saying, how are we different? Well, gray hair is...
I don't have a single one, and I don't use any dye, but I don't have any hair. No, just kidding.
You don't have any gray hair? You're like Ronald Reagan Jr.
Exactly, the old Gipper.
I wanted to ask briefly sort of snapshots, and I realize you weren't there likely with some of these folks, but the impact of, I guess, Ron Miller, you were there. Talk about in short strokes, Ron Miller and then Eisner, their impacts or their styles or however you want to go at it.
Well, Ron was an amazing guy. I mean, he's still alive. I met with him last fall when preparing to write the book, and he and his wife, Diane, are still vibrant, and they run a winery up in Napa, plus they run the museum in San Francisco. And Ron was a very creative guy, is a very creative guy, and he actually attempted to bring Eisner in several years before Eisner did come in and the huge takeover problems that the organization faced. And I think that what's important to think about here, Jim, is that despite the pressures that he had as a son-in-law, and you think about a major corporation, but it was still the familial pressure, so not much different than a family-run company when you think about, gosh, my aunt or my uncle wants me to go in this direction, but my sister or my sons or my dad wants me to go in another, being pulled in lots of directions. And I think Ron did a yeoman's job of guiding the company into a new environment. For example, under his watch is when the whole Touchstone label with Splash, with Daryl Hannah and Tom Hanks came out, that was completely against the grain of a traditional G-rated family movie, but he saw the need to expand the Disney brand into the preteen and the young adult audience.
Got the impression that Frank Wells had a huge behind-the-scenes sort of impact. Is that true?
No question. Frank Wells, actually when you think about it, Frank Wells and Roy Disney had some similar qualities in that they were detail-oriented and were kind of the operations gurus. And I would argue that Frank Wells and Michael Eisner were kind of the equivalent pairing of Roy Disney and Walt Disney, in that Frank Wells was a real doer and Michael Eisner a real dreamer, just like Walt and Roy. And Frank really was, using another metaphor, kind of the glue that held the creative team together.
Interesting. It may have explained some of the reason Eisner seemed to come off the rails later on without him.
Yeah, I think that if you read different accounts of Michael's career, the first 10 years when he was paired up with Frank, and then the second 10 years after Frank passed away tragically in that helicopter accident in '94 were decidedly different decades.
Robert Iger, who really comes outside of the Disney sphere completely, Eisner was at least in that industry.
Yeah, and I think Bob Iger, I don't know Bob because he was after I left the company, but he's done a very good job of balancing the qualities of running a business but maintaining creativity at the same time. And of course, every regime, every new change in management is going to have its supporters and its detractors.
Okay, we're going to go into Disney U as soon as we get back. This is Business Talk with Jim Campbell on the Business Talk Radio Network. The BTRN has over 300 stations affiliated around the country, and you can go to businesstalkradio.net to find the closest station to you or to listen on the internet, and also to access our archives of podcasts that are available. Stay with us. And we're talking with acclaimed speaker, author, and consultant, former Disney University executive as well, Doug Lipp, about Disney's famed customer-centric culture now, the secrets of Disney University. And I'll ask first, what exactly is Disney U? And talk about the spiritual guru, as you mentioned before, Van Arsdale, France, sort of the keeper of the moral torch there.
Well, Disney University is the training vehicle for cast members, supervisors, and executives, and it's found at every resort, it's found at every theme park, and it is the filter through which everyone must pass before they come into contact with the guest.
You refer to him, the book, Van, as a combination Jiminy Cricket, Mary Poppins, and Donald Duck. What do you mean?
Van France, the founder of the university, was hired by Walt about 6 months before Disneyland opened. We talked about 1955. So here's a man who was tasked by Walt to help create the happiest place on earth. And Walt told Van, we've had world-class architects come in to create the infrastructure, to create the environment, the rides, the storefronts, the restaurants, etc. But now we need to populate it with people who really know how to create happiness. And so can you imagine the pressure that Van must have felt when Walt said, go out and do this? And so what he did was create the first new hire onboarding process that really focused for the first time on the guest, and it really emphasized the idea that we are ambassadors of happiness. And what Van France was able to do over the years, Jim, was not just through that international program that he began with just one other guy, was he maintained the values, and he would guide the company, and he would guide employees like a gentle Mary Poppins or a gentle Jiminy Cricket to toe the line. But to answer your question, when we'd get off track a little bit, or we'd ask silly questions, or would come up with excuses for why we couldn't do something, Van could in an instant turn into this irascible, upset, angry Donald Duck and give you a dose of reality.
I found this very interesting. HR and training, are often sort of backwater, not power players. Often the first things cut, particularly training when there's any kind of downturn in the business. How did Disney U get to be so central to the success and mission of the company?
Well, it goes back to the question you asked earlier about the values and the DNA of the Disney organization. And I mentioned innovate, support, educate, and entertain. And that support component meant that executives were as invested in the success of Disney University as the Disney University. It means that those in operations, those executives that were in charge of running the theme park, essentially the factory, were singing from the same sheet of music as those in the university, whereas oftentimes, you and I've seen this, where what you've learned in training, as soon as that employee goes out to the front lines, his or her supervisor says, well, I don't care what you just learned in training. This is the real world out here. Listen to what I say. And that isn't the case.
Now, and this is also, I think, an interesting fact, that you joined Disney and right into training, and one wouldn't think that you would think about going into the Disney company through that avenue. What led you there?
As an intern in college, I did some work with one of the branches of the Disney University, and it got me hooked. And yes, indeed, I was one of the first people who came in from the outside. I didn't come up through operations as a ride operator, and the man who actually wrote the foreword of Disney University, Jim Cora, who retired as the chairman of Disney International, told me he kind of went out on a limb when he proposed that I be picked up as an intern because I was an outsider, and he said that helped me realize that we could populate the management teams with folks who had different ideas.
And you did not want or plan to get out into the mainline business. You wanted to really stay and focus and become an expert there.
I've always liked education in a variety of forms, and I was fully bought into the whole concept of what the Disney University was doing and its direct connection with operations, most definitely.
In those 4 core values, a couple of questions. On the innovation one, how do you think an institution does institutionalize risk-taking?
You start any kind of institutionalization is really the culture of the company. It always starts at the top. So it's the CEO, it's the board members, it's the supervisor, it's the director, it's the regional manager, it's the vice president. Whoever is at the top of whatever chain you're talking about, she or he has to demonstrate that they are okay with taking risk, and they themselves go out and take a risk. And when employees or team members take risks and fail, what is the consequence? And what I like to say is that we at Disney were encouraged to fail successfully, learn from it, and move forward. Don't create the same problem again if it turned into a problem, but give it a shot.
And by the way, we'll talk about admitting mistakes. I was very impressed with that. A lot of companies, particularly great companies, are unable to do that until it's too late.
Yeah.
How did you guys, in terms of balancing the big picture, the culture, the DNA, with operations in the trenches down to the guy's exact job who's onboarding?
Well, I think one of the things that Van France started when he created the Disney University was he populated it with people that knew the business, and he made sure that the message that was conveyed in training was exactly what was going on in the real world. And when you have people that are aware of the operational impact of having training or not, or the operational impact of blaming training when you shouldn't blame training. I'll give you an example, Jim. Again, Jim Cora, who wrote the foreword, said, picture for a moment you've got these bales of hay in Frontierland and the weeds are growing out of the bales of hay because they've not been taken care of. Do you pound on the training team for not training the maintenance folks on better techniques for cutting weeds? He said, no. You pound on the operations team because they've been pinching pennies. Those bales of hay should have been replaced months ago.
Interesting, and I was also impressed by the company won't compromise quality. Talk briefly about the story of Mr. Lincoln.
Well, the idea with Mr. Lincoln at the New York World's Fair in '64 was the first human figure of an audio animatronic robot that Disney created, and Walt was determined for the state of Illinois to create this figure. And long story short, the figure of Lincoln was supposed to start in a seated position and then stand up and deliver his address. Well, at the premiere at the State Fair, at the World's Fair in New York, the governor of Illinois and 500 delegates from around the country, media, were in the audience, and Mr. Lincoln couldn't stand up. And the team was saying, well, let's just have him start standing and then he'll deliver his address. And Walt was saying, no, that's not how it's supposed to run. So Walt actually went out on stage and addressed the audience and apologized that the show wouldn't run, but he's not going to put a show on unless it absolutely works. And Ron Miller, when I was talking to him last fall, again, Walt Disney's son-in-law and the former CEO of the company, he said, I'll always remember this poor Mr. Lincoln that's just halfway out of his chair, and then he would stop, and all the engineers, the Imagineers, would scramble about trying to look at the software and the hardware. But the point is that unless the show is ready, you don't put it on. And Walt himself was willing to take the hit for canceling a show as opposed to putting on a half-baked show.
In about 10 or 15 seconds, where did the term guests originate?
That started with Van France.
Okay, the next segment, we're going to talk about how Disney U helped turn around turnover from 82% down to 28% and some other interesting topics. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell on the Business Talk Radio Network, nationally syndicated on over 300 affiliated stations on the Business Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH in Greenwich, Connecticut. And we're talking about Disney University with Doug Lipp here on our segment 3, Disney Under the Hood now. And as I mentioned before, we were impressed that Disney's looked at problems and mistakes directly in the eye and gone and fixed them. We're going to look at a couple of them now. And the opening of these Disney World and Tokyo Disney are just unbelievable, hiring 5,000 to 10,000 people. Disney World is 43 acres. They do a great job, and then when the initial stuff finishes and there's some burnout, you guys saw problems. You saw employee morale plummet and turnover, as we briefly mentioned, going up. How did you guys deal with this in the sort of the Cinderella Castle story?
Well, first of all, Disney World is 43 square miles. It's 27,000 plus acres, so it's a massive environment. And what we found and I wasn't at Disney World, I wasn't in the company when this occurred, but the director of the university, a man named Tom Eastman, shared this example with me, and I think it goes to show that even an organization as iconic as Disney will have problems, and you have to punch the problems right in the nose if you want to deal with it. And what happened, kind of the story we were talking about earlier, is Walt Disney World opened in 1971, and within a few months of that is when Roy Disney passed away. So you had Walt was gone, Roy was gone, and then after any grand opening of anything, and your listeners can relate to this if they've opened any store, any office, is you wear lots of hats, it's a tremendous adrenaline rush, and then there's a drop-off in energy after the opening, and it's predictable, the honeymoon will end, and all of us have been through this. And what's amazing to me in this example, in this chapter, in fact, I call it The Honeymoon Will End, is Tom Eastman directed to me an idea. He said his boss at the time said, we have to look at the symbol of the company, and the symbol of the company is the Cinderella Castle in the middle of the park. And long story short, the executives from the company started meeting in the Cinderella Castle, and this was not a fancy room, it was a construction room, and these guys had to crawl up construction stairs or go up a rickety construction elevator, and weekly they had meetings in the Cinderella Castle looking down on the kingdom, realizing, you know what, around us, this place is crumbling, and we better get our act together, or else it's going to be a short-lived show.
And lo and behold, a number of recommendations were put in, and retention went from only 17% to 72%, which is pretty unbelievable. In fact, one thing that amazes me is a lot of these employees are by definition transient, and yet not IBM, that's where my wife works, and I started out, and also an iconic company. Disney spends all this investment on training and is so dependent on the cast, and a lot of them are transient.
Well, you know what's interesting? Part of this puzzle, Jim, is that, and Van France, again, the man whom I write about in Disney U, was adamant that before you even train people, you get the right people on board. And he was saying, you know, if all of our marketing posters to get cast members in are about smiling employees who are on stage or on Main Street during daylight hours, if everything is about that, but a good percentage of the cast members you're hiring are going to be on graveyard cleaning kitchens or scrubbing sinks, that's kind of misrepresenting the brand, isn't it? And so he was adamant that the pre-show for cast members, when they're being recruited, be as honest as possible so that you had less of a shock factor when people got onto their jobs.
And then Disney Retail, I guess when it started off, and this is very impressive for Disney U, that Eisner and Wells were in there, found that it wasn't up to snuff and wasn't differentiating itself. And they came to Disney U, which was not involved with training on the retail side. And like in a weekend, you guys came up with a plan. But talk about what happened at Disney Retail.
Well, first of all, you've really done your homework. I appreciate that. You're a very good interviewer. They found, Eisner and Wells found that going through the first Disney store, the flagship store, it was that aside from the unique products, the Disney plush, the stuffed animals, the toys, the store did not stand out from any other store in the mall in which it was built. It was the standard approach. The cast members were less than engaged, and they found out that the training had not been done by the Disney University. It had actually been done by a crew from the Disney stores, and so they challenged the team at the Disney studio, the university up there, to turn this around. And quite frankly, within 2.5, 3 days, the crew, the team there, turned around the program and actually involved the cast members in a very Van France-infused, experiential, entertaining, and educating program wherein the cast members secret shopped other stores in the mall. They realized, wow, these other stores have fairly lackadaisical employees, and then at the end of that process, the Disney University told them, well, you know what, we secret shopped you last week, and you came across the same way. And they turned the store into a living laboratory of good show versus bad show, and what does it look like when you engage a guest personally, and how do you keep people engaged as customers, but also get product out the door. It's that fine balance of having a system in place, but also smiling while you're doing it.
Tell us now about you actually went over and led the training and launching of the onboarding and getting things off the ground in Tokyo Disneyland.
Yeah, that was the first international theme park for the Disney organization. It actually opened up 30 years ago this last April, so it's amazing that 30 years have come and gone, and it was an amazing challenge. I happen to speak Japanese fluently, so that was one of the benefits that I had, was to go in and help both hire and train the thousands of cast members that would run the park, but also help set up the university with a very dedicated group of Japanese. And I think the key, Jim, is that we actually brought Japanese leaders over to Disneyland and Disney World for 6 to 18 months for on-the-job training, and they lived through mini openings. They lived through daily operations. So they were really fully ensconced in the corporate culture before Tokyo Disneyland ever opened. And they actually became bigger cheerleaders of the culture than many in the United States.
And how did you balance the nuance between, respecting Japanese culture and in Euro Disney as well, and what you wanted to do to make sure you maintain the Disney culture, even down to levels of the no alcohol policy in the U.S.?
That derails a lot of international teams, as you and your listeners well know. And here's an example: the Disney name badges. And Walt Disney was a firm believer in first name basis, which was revolutionary in the 50s and 60s. And all cast members to this day wear a name badge that has their first name on, which pretty much everybody around the world does anymore. It's not a big deal. But when Tokyo Disneyland was in the nascent stages of being developed, this became a huge bone of contention between the Japanese and the Americans. And the Japanese said, with all due respect, we are a last name culture, and we're not going to put our first names on a name badge. And Disney said, well, that's just the way it's going to be. What ultimately turned out, which was a brilliant decision, was while the Japanese were in the U.S. training, they had to have a first name on their name badge, a nickname or whatever. And then upon return to Japan, they were allowed to create a second name badge that had their last name on it. And it sounds ridiculously simple, but if this is part of the DNA and part of the culture that's been around for decades, and it's what the founder wanted, you can only imagine the animated discussions that were occurring backstage between executives from both sides of this thing. And then likewise, you mentioned the alcohol. We chose not to offer alcohol in Tokyo Disneyland, whether it was sake or wine or beer, and it was a huge risk. But the man who I mentioned earlier, Jim Core, was adamant that we maintain the Disney family standards. And quite frankly, after Tokyo Disneyland opened, many housewives actually sent letters in to the company thanking us for not having alcohol in the park because their husbands didn't come in, drink too much, and then disengage from the family. But on the flip side then, over at Euro Disney at Disneyland Paris, Michael Eisner and the team decided to offer wine because Disney was viewed as the quote-unquote cultural Chernobyl of not being flexible. And despite offering wine, it didn't really turn out into any kind of a profit center because the French weren't sitting down having long lunches. They were engaged in the rides in the park.
I thought that was interesting, yeah, and they did this, sort of the same behavior as Americans. You talk about the art and science as we get down to the last minute and a half. The attractions don't break down, and Snow White never has a bad day. What does that mean?
That's really the DNA of the company. Is you might have a competitor with faster rides, but the rides are going to probably break down. Or you might have competitors with more employees, but they may not be as friendly or as engaged. And that's one of the things that we focused on at Disneyland and Disney World and all the resorts all the time, is let's make sure our rides are absolutely bulletproof and that our cast members are always friendly. And if we can balance that, and most organizations today cannot, they have either foot in the technological side, they've got a great product, or they have great employees, but having both is something that escapes many companies. And all too often I see organizations that have really friendly employees, that are offering tons of excuses about products that have broken down, or they've got really great products, but they have employees that are indifferent.
And we'll give you an example in my own family how actually there was a slight breakdown at Disney, and the folks were so empowered. We were on that, it's a small world, and the boat stopped for a while, and they didn't tell us what was going on, and it was kind of scary. So we got off, and my wife went and complained, and there were 6 of us. They gave us free full park passes for 1 week for 6, and that is a huge amount of money if we'd had to buy it, and whoever was there in customer service was empowered to do it, and it obviously has left a great memory on us forever. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell on the Business Talk Radio Network. We'll be right back. Our guest is Doug Lipp, a veteran of Disney University, and we're talking about Disney's secrets for maintaining a culture of excellence in customer service at the Walt Disney Company. Disney University, lessons learned. Let me ask you this, Doug. You're obviously in the business of helping other companies now, and Disney's rather unique. Folks wearing costumes, kids focus, customers called guests. Is this applicable across other industries?
Yes, the whole idea of creating a culture that will resonate with the team, and it's more than slapping a fancy moniker or name on a customer or on a guest or on an employee or on a teammate. And one of the things that Van France would talk to us about at Disney University is, yes, we call our cast members by a fancy name, we call our guests by a fancy name, but really more important than that is the culture that supports it that I mentioned earlier about innovate, support, educate, and entertain. And so I challenge a lot of my clientele to say it's more than just slapping a coat of paint on a building and expecting that new, fresh coat of paint to make the building stand up and pass inspection. It's about assessing the foundation of that building first. And that's the challenge that most organizations really don't fully address.
And, okay, so I'm running a business. I bring you in, and the first thing I say is I don't have the staff or budget to do what, this great investment that Disney makes. How do I justify doing this?
Well, you have to decide what the consequences are going to be if you don't do it. That's the business owners or the business decisions dilemma. And also, Van France would say budgets might be tight, but creativity is always free. And so I would challenge any organization to say, yes, if training is too expensive and you don't get the return on the investment, don't do it. In fact, many of the companies that I go in and consult with, I will say get rid of the training program you've got because it's not applicable in the real world. Training doesn't have to be in a fancy room. It could be 5-second, 5-minute, 5-hour bursts of on-the-job training, or it could be mentoring, but it doesn't have to be sexy and expensive.
Interesting. And you mentioned some organizations may not be ready for training.
Some organizations aren't ready for training because they don't value education. They look at training as something that you just slap on at the end of the production line, much like if you had a factory with quality control at the end of the line, and we've all seen how that doesn't work in any organization.
Now, Disney's been brilliant at this. You develop a product or a ride in the park, and suddenly it's cross-platformed into movies, into Disney retail. How do you guys, and what's the role of Disney University in making that cross-platform synergies work?
Well, as an example, at Disney Studios, one of the programs that we had up there was called Disney Way 1, wherein you had executives from all aspects of the business coming together to learn each other's business. So you had people in films going to theme parks and actually putting on Tigger costumes and walking the park as an employee would. You had employees from the operations team going into ESPN or going into ABC. And so the idea is that we as a team need to learn as much about each other's businesses as possible so that we can look for those opportunities to leverage every product and every brand.
Do you really include the folks at ESPN in how you do these kind of programs?
Yes, and that's really a key thing is you take a look at all the different divisions that are in any organization and have to have a really challenging discussion sometimes with owners, because oftentimes owners will say, well, that team doesn't really matter, but it's amazing how some really creative ideas can come from fairly bizarre places.
In looking at breaking down silos, tell us about the Greenlight experience.
Well, the Greenlight experience is part of that training program that was conducted at the studios, wherein you had executives from all over the company greenlighting a script. Greenlighting is giving it the green light, giving it the go, no-go sign. And part of a training program was to have executives greenlight one of two scripts, and they would challenge each other. They'd come up with ideas, and then at the end of this process, they would greenlight either script A or script B. And then the real teams would come in, the real movie makers would come in, and they'd say, well, you know what? We've actually greenlit one of the two, and this is why. So that got the trainees, who were vice presidents of operations or vice presidents of the studio, engaged with a discussion as to why would you greenlight this versus that, and what are the opportunities we have for marketing the dolls, the toys, or whatever from this greenlit movie. So it really brought into the training environment, even for executives, a dose of massive realism that ensured the training would be perpetuated.
And by the way, fun and humor are part of all this too.
Indeed, and one of the other things to mention is that when you have the chairman of Disney Studios participating in the training as a facilitator, when you have the vice chairman of Imagineering participating in some of the debriefs and discussions about how do you create an attraction, that sends a message to some of these grizzled veterans that, you know what, this company really does put their money where their mouth is, and management does support training. That is something that's lacking in a lot of companies.
By the way, that's a great point, because I just got from Goldman Sachs sent me some stuff, because as you know, they got off the rails a bit during the 2008 financial crisis, and they've actually just put in a new business standards report, and now they're implementing it, and 23 sessions with all the managing directors, 2 to 3 hour presentations by who? The chairman, blank fine. So they've sort of got the message. It's got to come from the top down. Let me ask you this now. I'm running a business, and we're having, revenues are down 30-40%. And my brother's running a business, revenues are up 30-40%. His resources are spread too thin. I don't have the money. What do you say to that?
Well, I would look and find out why your brother has a business that is that is succeeding, and forget about the emotion and the challenge and the ego as to why yours is tanking and his isn't. And I would ask, are there any similarities, even if it's in a different part of the country or if it's a completely different product line? What is he doing? What is his executive team doing with their connection with their employees and with the marketplace that you're not doing?
Do you think that training is viable in both those environments?
Training is indispensable in any organization, Jim. It's just a matter of how you roll it out. Again, Jim Cora, the guy who wrote the foreword to Disney University, who has years of experience, decades of experience, both in the bare-knuckle operations, razor-thin margins, and in the Disney University, would say this: marketing is the time and money you invest to get people in the door, whether it's customers or employees. Training is the investment you make to get them to stay and come back. So whether it's loyal employees or loyal customers, training is continually plussing the show. It's continually polishing the employees and the environment. And all too often, organizations put all their money into maintaining the hardware or the infrastructure, and they forget about the employees, and then that part of the equation crumbles.
And that was where I was going to end up the show, actually, and really the huge value added of training. So in the remaining 20 seconds that I'm going to give you, what's the major takeaway you'd want people to come away with today?
Create your organizational culture. And I'll quote Van France on this. He said, quote, "I was convinced that managers and owners could come and go, but Walt's dream would last forever." What is the culture of your organization? Is it what you want it to be right now? And what are you doing to perpetuate it?
Doug's book, Disney U, How Disney University Develops the World's Most Engaged, Loyal, and Customer-Centric Employees. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks again to Doug Lipp for a great show. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. And again, a great thanks to Doug Lipp for staying with us on Overtime here exclusively on Yale Radio, WYBC.com. Out in the real world now, consulting. Do you have any case stories? Or let me ask you first, what are some of the companies that you think are in the level in customer service and excellence and maintaining a culture of excellence?
Well, there are lots of different examples out there, but I have to suggest that we talk so much in the earlier segments about corporate culture and DNA and leadership and management support. And one company stands out in particular in a very challenging competitive field of the Home Depot, Lowe's kinds of environments, the self-help centers for construction, and it's a company called Menards. Menards is big in the Midwest, and they, I think, exemplify the values that I saw at Disneyland and Disney World, and that really helped set an organization apart in a very competitive marketplace.
What do you think of a company like IBM that's famous for it and that I obviously have experience with?
Well, IBM's been through many changes, as has Disney, from being a provider of hardware systems to more software and cloud computing and consulting services. And even IBM, when I talk about the change in the grooming standards at Disneyland and what a tumultuous change that was for the good, even IBM a couple of decades ago went from the iconic blue suit, white collar, tie to a business casual, which was already in place in Silicon Valley. And even to make that change for IBM exemplified the flexibility they realized they had to bring to the marketplace.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. When I was there right out of business school, it's just sometimes I would just say, like, I got to be a little bit of a rebel here, and I'd come in with a striped shirt or a blue shirt, and invariably the number 2 guy would come by and say, "Are you in your pajamas today? Did you forget to get dressed today?"
It's all relative, isn't it? What's Casual Friday in Silicon Valley versus in Armonk or anywhere else, right?
There's a great. I was reading the review for the movie that's coming out called The Intern that takes place at Google, right?
Oh, sure.
And the review says the excitement, the dynamism of that place, because they did film it at Google, makes the IBM of the 1950s look like Siberia. Do you now? Some of the companies you're working for, I don't know if you're allowed or not. Do you have an interesting case study for us?
Well, many times I cannot because I've signed multiple NDAs. But there's an example of Starbucks. So a huge brand which has been through its own tumultuous times. And you alluded to earlier about empowerment. And there's an example of a Starbucks I wrote about in a previous book, that the employee, the manager of the store, noticed a group of deaf and hard of hearing customers coming in, ordering coffee, and then having sign language discussions. Well, she did a focus group with them. She had an employee who could sign, and they told her that ordering coffee was really challenging for that population because menus were way behind the wall. I mean, 20 feet behind the cash register on a wall. How do I point to that product and in a quick and easy fashion convey to you what size coffee I want? So by listening to this group, she implemented what they suggested. She put a menu at each cash register, laminated that in plastic, and then attached a erasable marking pen to each of those things. So now when that deaf or hard of hearing customer could walk up, they just circled the product they wanted, and the transaction is completed in mere seconds. And here's the point. It wasn't just making people happy. Her business exploded from 25 to 30 deaf and hard of hearing customers coming in to over 300 on Friday nights. That's 1,000% increase in business. And when you look at the margins on coffee, that's pretty robust.
That's an amazing story. Do you have an example, sort of a reverse iconic example of a company that really either failed or really suffered by not figuring out how to get this right or lost its bearings?
Yeah, Disney. Thanks to the lead-in. We almost lost the company in '83 because of an indifference, essentially, to customers and wanting to maintain the history more than blazing new trails. And I have to say that I was in the company during that time. It was a very tumultuous time. And it was also probably the best thing that could have happened to us because it shook us to the core and made us realize. In fact, Marty Sklar, the man who was the chairman of Imagineering, shared with me a really interesting quote. He worked with Walt for decades. And when I was writing Disney U, I talked with Marty, and he said, unlike many people in the world, Walt Disney had the ability, and this is Marty's quote, Walt had 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the future. Very few individuals have that quality. You might look at a Steve Jobs or some other iconic figures, but rarely does that quality reside in one person. And when Walt passed away in '66, the Disney organization didn't have a succession plan to fill the shoes of that iconic dreamer. And the company became very conservative and risk-averse, and ultimately, almost 18 years later, the company was on the ropes.
And there's the Vince Lombardi illusion always that he he won for Green Bay, but there was no successor, and they were 20 years in the wilderness. Is how do you groom a successor when you have such a dynamic founder or leader at the time?
You know, it may not reside, Jim, in one person. It might have to be a team of people, because trying to look for that precise nugget might be an exercise in frustration. The idea is that while that while that founder or that iconic figure is still around, is to encourage him or her to groom others. And all too often, that iconic person is such a powerful person, his or her subordinates don't have the horsepower to say, you know what, this ride's going to end, and we've got to start grooming other people, and having the guts to approach that kind of an iconic leader and even suggest that he or she is going to be gone someday is the first and most difficult step, I think, in that process.
Staying in this lost period, Ron Miller, who was one of the successors, the son-in-law, and somebody you were positive about, was there nepotism there, and that he might have been over his head in any event, or that he really couldn't right the ship, or do you put blame on him at all?
Well, any leader has to accept some blame, and it's possible that earlier in this whole process he could have been more assertive with some of the board members that really were trying to maintain the past and circle the wagons. But frankly, I think that Ron is a very nice man, and that was probably his undoing, is that he had the creative ideas, but in order to push those ideas through, sometimes in any kind of a business you have to really be the hard ass, forgive my French. And relatively speaking, I don't think that when it got to that level of intensity that he was willing and able to push certain people out the door that needed to be shown the door because they'd been in a creative coma for 2 decades.
As I recall, there were vultures, private equity houses circling Disney. And do you think if one of those had been executed, they would have destroyed the firm inevitably, the business?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there was one of them, Saul Steinberg, who in his own autobiography said that he realized that he shouldn't destroy the organization because he was walking along the beach with one of his kids and basically said something to the effect of, "Daddy, please don't kill the mouse." So it's hard to say if it would have been dismembered, dismantled, or if it would have been made stronger, but it certainly would have been a different organization.
What was the formula for the turnaround? And obviously bringing in Eisner, what saved the company?
Well, certainly the Bass brothers were a big part of that with their infusion of capital and giving their approval of certain things, and certainly Roy E. Disney, Roy O. Disney's son and Walt's nephew, he and Stanley Gold with Shamrock Holdings as major shareholders saw their stock prices tanking, and so he blessed bringing in new people. And the magic in all of that, Jim, was, as I alluded to earlier, is that Michael Eisner and Frank Wells, I think, represented the second coming of Walt Disney and Roy Disney. They were a team of dreamer and doer, and together, under their watch, you had in that first decade of Michael's regime, just tremendous successes. Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King. And why stop with an animated movie when you can go to New York City, refurbish a dilapidated theater, and create Tony Award-winning Broadway plays?
I'm happy to say I bought some Disney stock right around that period they brought them in, and it skyrocketed for a long while.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, this was obviously a business that was a theme park business only. Now there's broadcasting, there's sports broadcasting on cable, movies, animation, retail. What's the sort of the scope or the size of the various divisions? What dominates Disney now? Is it ESPN?
Yeah, I think it would be ESPN. You look at the revenue that they have and the decisions that they've made to expand that environment. Although the theme parks just last month reported tremendous profits, and one of the things that you see when the economy turns sour, as it has for the past 4 or 5 years, and finally turning around, is people tend not to go on long vacations or international vacations, or if there's the threat of violence in a foreign location, people tend to stay home. And the parks, whether they're in Tokyo, whether it's in Hong Kong, whether it's in Paris, whether it's in the United States, are the beneficiaries of that.
Is there a reason why, and maybe it's because they need such a big space and location, you had the 1955 Disneyland, 71 Disney World, then Tokyo, then Paris. Why hasn't there been much greater expansion like a normal franchise would? And I understand there's one being built in Hong Kong, right?
Well, Hong Kong is done. That's
it's
been
done.
up for a number of years. The next one is going to be in Shanghai that opens
Shanghai,
in
okay,
2015.
yeah.
Hong Kong is a smaller footprint, and they're looking at expanding it. But to answer your question, I think it boils down to any decision of not trying to cannibalize yourself. And quite frankly, the Disney stores did go through that period where they were expanded. It no longer had that elite status, and then there was a pullback from that marketplace. So I think it's a matter of maintaining the exclusivity of the brand.
So you don't think we'll ever see 50 Disney Worlds around the world?
Well, it's hard to say because Walt Disney himself didn't initially envision another theme park. In fact, he said with the success of the Three Little Pigs, he said, you can't top pigs with pigs. So let's not have sequels. Let's just keep creating new stuff.
Is Disney World much more successful than Disneyland?
Well, I think successful in a way that, yes, you had the land in which you could create new stuff. And by the time Walt and the team were purchasing the land at Disney World in Florida, they had the ability to buy so many thousands of acres by which to have complete control over the environment and create new gates, new lands, new approaches. So yes, I think that environment lends itself to more creativity and hence more success.
Do you think Disney is still a growth company, or is it a mature company now?
Well, I think it's a growth company, and it'll be interesting to see when Bob Iger retires. What kind of the question we were challenging each other with a few minutes ago is what is the succession plan? And of course, Steve Jobs had been on the board of directors of Disney. Steve Jobs is no longer around. What happens when Bob Iger retires? So I'd be interested to see, and I don't know the answer to this, what is the succession plan for those dreamers and those doers, and who really is going to be driving the business. Right now, I think it's a growth opportunity.
Interesting. Talk a little bit about, because we have in Disney Imagineering, and how they maintain innovation and where they come up with these rides, et cetera.
Well, Disney Imagineering, that's the engineering team that creates the rides, and Walt originally created this as kind of a skunk works. It was originally called WED, those are the initials for Walter Elias Disney. And he realized that he had to have this creative team that wasn't under the auspices of any corporate control, so that this could be like a laboratory of new ideas. And Imagineering, Walt Disney Imagineering, now it's known as, is a tremendous place of creativity and breaking new ground for the theme parks, and also taking ideas from the movies and making sure that if you've got Pirates of the Caribbean or you've got some other film out there, that your rides are up to snuff.
And going back now to being in the park, talk about popcorn empowerment, and I'm also intrigued by the fact that the maintenance team is also trained to think about working or talking with guests as well.
Well, it kind of gets back to the question you asked me at the very beginning, is what is the role of the Disney University? And the idea is that every cast member, every employee goes through training before they come into contact with guests. So if you're working as a maintenance person, if you're working as a sweeper on Main Street, you realize that that's just part of your job. You have to keep your eyes and ears open for guests that might be confused or they're looking for a lost child, and realize that standing up and not fixing that sprinkler head right now is more important. Which is more important, the sprinkler head or that guest who's upset or the guest who's looking for their child? So the priorities are very clear. The popcorn empowerment is an example. If I'm a sweeper on Main Street and my job is to pick up trash, I've always got my eyes and ears open for problems or challenges. And one of those could be the 4-year-old child that you hear crying. And we trained our cast members. You know, you hear that child crying over by the popcorn kiosk. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that what has just happens thousands of times in a week, is that child was given a box of popcorn by mom or dad and promptly drops it. And then the kid starts crying, or mom and dad start yapping at the kid for not holding on to the popcorn. That's bad show on stage, which isn't allowed at Disney. And so the cast members were empowered to go over and produce a free box of popcorn for this kid. Kneel down next to the kid and say, "Hey, buddy, is that your popcorn?" "Well, I've got a secret to share with you for Mickey Mouse." Well, in a split second, just by kneeling down and sharing that example, the kid stops crying. Mom and dad and maybe 14 or 15 other guests are now locked on to this interaction, and it's gone from a negative into a massively positive environment. And maybe the investment is 25 cents for a box of popcorn that might cost the guest $4 or $5. But the odds, Jim, are tremendously high that the guests who see this are going to talk more about this interaction upon returning home than the multi-million-dollar ride system on Space Mountain that kept them safe.
Exactly. Another counterintuitive thing is you talked about how efficiency shouldn't necessarily override the guest experience. An example of if there's a long line at either the store or in the park, and rather than focusing on just trying to run through everything as quickly as possible, not even looking at the guest in the eye, you should maybe do the inverse and let efficiency slip a little.
Yes, in fact, efficiency is the last on 4 priorities. Safety is number 1, then comes courtesy. Are you friendly? Show aspect is, are you clean? Is the park clean? Are the rides clean? Safety, courtesy, show. And then the last on the priority list is efficiency. And everything must pass through the filter of safety, courtesy, and show before you start getting people through the rides more rapidly. And that's absolutely crystal clear in every cast member's mind. They know the marching orders.
And talking of cast members, I think people might be interested in part of the burnout process when you were trying to reinvigorate. Tell us some of the things that go on behind the scenes for cast members to keep them motivated.
Well, the idea is that you treat cast members as your most important guest. So employees are always the most important guest because they are the link to the customers, the paying public. And so you produce not necessarily, it's something that can be done for anybody. For example, yes, the Disney organization spends a lot of money on nice break rooms and recreation opportunities. But quite frankly, it starts even earlier than that when you treat a potential applicant with respect when he or she comes into the recruiting office. And the interview process exudes that kind of respect. And so from day one, when a potential employee and an employee come into contact with the organization, you are shown the kind of respect that the company expects you to then show to cast members, or to guests. So, for example, at Disney University, when we would have new hires coming in for their new first day on the job, we were always prepared for them. We didn't have them just wander into a room and wonder when is the orientation going to start. Oh, the coffee's over there, go help yourself. We treated that as a show, and as soon as they came to the front door, we had the music playing, the training materials were ready, we were smiling, we were ready to show them exactly the kind of show we expected them to produce in 10 or 15 days when they were released for duty.
Now, obviously, the nature of a park opening is you're front-loading all your hiring, and so you're hiring 5,000 and more to open these parks, and that increases rapidly, and there's probably 5 to 10 times that number of applicants to go through. How do you build the pipeline and how to manage that process?
Well, one of the things that I often challenge a lot of my clients with who don't have the budget to go out and recruit a lot of people is one of the best sources of filling that pipeline is your existing employees. And if you run a really good shop, you're going to have your best employees convey that information to their friends. And I'll never forget, I was working with a fast food restaurant chain, and they have thousands of stores across the country, and I was at their conference, and one of the owners stood up. There were 5,000 people in the room, and one of the owners stood up and said, I want to thank all the people that have this restaurant in my town because you are so mean. You're driving people away, and all the good people are coming to my store. Thank you all very much. So the idea is that if you run a respectful shop, the word will get out, and you will attract the best people from your community, whether it's high school students or PhD scientists.
Okay, we're getting down to our last minute and a half. Okay, that was the rapid hiring. Now, what happens, how does Disney University respond, or you give consulting advice when things start to slow down and I'm not getting promoted as fast as I'd hoped?
Well, that's part of being honest with people up front, Jim, is that if you misrepresent the brand or the opportunities, you will have ridiculously high turnover. So I think it even precedes that is to give people an idea of what is the culture you're coming into. Is it one where we encourage risk-taking and you're going to move rapidly, or it's a more staid operation where you might be in the same job for 2 or 3 years, and are you okay with that? Letting that come out well in advance of hiring somebody, I think, is crucial.
And in the last 30 seconds for you, the Volunteers program, Volunteers, benefits both Disney's brand and the charitable focus they give to.
Indeed, and you see more and more with millennials and the younger generation is they want to work for or patronize organizations that give back. And this was started decades ago by a guy named Jeff Hoffman, whom I also interviewed for Disney U. And quite frankly, people do want to work for and give their money to organizations that give back to the community in one form or another.
And again, a great thanks to Doug Lipp for staying with us on Overtime here exclusively on Yale Radio, WYBC.com. And it's an appropriate day for the show because today is the 79th birthday of Donald Duck, one of the great mainstays of the Disney brand. 79 years, a testament to maintaining a great firm for a long time. That's the 79th birthday of Donald Duck. Next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell, you will not want to miss it. We are going to do the fall of the Galleon Hedge Fund on insider trading. There's a new book out that reads like a thriller as the feds move in to get Rajaratnam, and including the former chairman of the prestigious McKinsey firm, Raja Gupta. That's the fall of the Galleon Hedge Fund on Business Talk with Jim Campbell next week. Stay with us then. Come back. Thanks for joining us on a Sunday. This is Business Talk with Jim Campbell on Yale Radio.